Homeland Security or FBI saying, why are you going on the Clay Douglas show?
My message to those guys, if they're listening this morning, is go get a cup of coffee. Maybe you'll learn something.
We both took the same oath, to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I don't recall there being an expiration date on that.
I'm going to keep my big VA, keep my friends the same, keep the government out of my business, and y'all can keep the change.
He is the free American, Clay Douglas.
We know what we need. We know who to blame.
Catch the Free American Hour, weekdays at 7 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Eastern.
I'll keep the USA and y'all can keep the change.
For the podcast and more details, visit www.freeamerican.com or catch the podcast by phone by calling 832-999-8621.
All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of the Free American Hour. I am your host. I am Clay Douglas. And let me see here. My guest today is Jonna. Is it Bianco?
Bianco, yes.
And Jonna, you're with the American Bondholders Foundation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Now, how long is I think I've heard something about that, but could you give me a little rundown on what this organization is, how long you've been in existence, before we get into the subject of the Chinese sovereign debt and failed obligations?
Well, the American Bondholders Foundation represents approximately 20,000 bondholders and families here in the U.S., encompassing 44 states that are holders of defaulted sovereigns of the People's Republic of China.
Now, everybody kind of operates here on the idea that China owns America, we owe them all the money and all that, but that's not quite true, is it?
No, that's just a political statement that our politicians like to use, and the media likes to use. At the end of the day, China only holds approximately 8, maybe 9% of our U.S. treasuries. They buy those treasuries through our trade deficit. And they get a trade deficit because Americans buy so much of China's products here on U.S. soil. So for last year, for example, we had a $273 billion trade deficit with China. 90% of that goes to buy U.S. treasuries. The other 10% goes to buy corporate stocks or bonds and properties and businesses, so on and so forth. But that trade deficit that we have is because China only buys about 5% of American goods, and we buy 35% of their goods. That's what creates that deficit. And they use that deficit to continue to buy more U.S. treasuries. But they only own 8 to 9% of our treasuries. But in reality, we are holding more defaulted paper of equivalent treasury-type paper from the government of China than what they hold of ours.
Well, let me read this. Now, we've got a link directly to this document up on my website, and hopefully we've got people from all over the world picking this up, and we'll pick it up. Everything will be recorded. But to give you folks just a little bit of background, from 900 to 1940, the Chinese government issued millions of dollars in sovereign debt, mostly notably a large tract of 25 million pounds, valued at 5% in 1913, set to mature in 1960. This massive bond funded the modernization of China's infrastructure and was widely acquired at that time by governments, banks, and investors all over the globe. However, in 1938, China defaulted on its binding engagement on the government of the Republic of China and its successors, leaving millions of global creditors unpaid. In accordance with the terms of the bond, successor government doctrines, and accounting standards, the United States can and should hold China acceptable to its obligations. The Chinese bonds in question are held throughout the world by treasuries, banks, companies, and over 20,000 private U.S. investors, many of which are active in seeking remuneration. But the U.S. Treasury and Departments of Justice or State are understood to hold substantial portions of this Chinese sovereign debt. These holdings have not been fully cataloged, nor has the U.S. government moved to hold China accountable for its debt obligations. Why not?
Well, political reasons. The basic reason is they want other things from China. I mean, there's just such a multitude of issues involving China, from the North Korean nuclear crisis to the Iranian nuclear crisis to weapons proliferation to rogue countries and terrorist organizations that are killing American soldiers overseas, to intellectual property theft. I mean, just a multitude of problems that people have with China. This just adds one more to that stack of issues and problems that our government has with China. And instead of standing up to China and holding them accountable to play by the same rules that everybody else plays by, they choose to kowtow to them and ignore the issue. And so from the U.S. Department of State's perspective, Treasury's perspective, and our administration, they basically ignore this issue in hopes that we would just go away. But the American people are owed $1 trillion of debt from the government of China. This isn't a corporate stock from a company that went bankrupt or went out of business. These are government sovereign bonds, no different than a United States Treasury. And we pay 100 cents on the dollar plus interest to China for the treasuries they hold of ours, and they need to be held accountable to the same.
So why isn't the government moving to put some pressure? I mean, we gave China a favored nation status after they defaulted on the debt. This is all the way back in before the United Nations showed up.
That is correct. They did default prior to actually the Republic of China, what we know today as being Taiwan, which was ousted by the communist regime and pushed to the island that we know as Taiwan. They announced they were in default at the beginning of 1938. However, compliments to the United States government, less than 90 days after they announced to the world that they could no longer service their debt, the United States government authorized the Republic of China to issue new and more bonds again in April, beginning in April of 1938, all the way through 1938, 1939, 1940, and those bonds were issued in a U.S. dollar-denominated currency. It is our clear understanding that the U.S. government, using taxpayers' dollars, bought the majority of those bonds, knowing they were already in default, and have allowed them to remain in default all these years. The communist regime came in, took over the People's Republic of China, took the seat at the United Nations as the official government body of China. They are the recognized entity for China, and they just absolutely refuse to pay. And I think they refuse to pay Americans because our government has not made it an issue with them. Our government has made defaulted bond issues an issue with 47 other countries who had defaulted bonds, and made them come to the table, settle their debts, and pay their financial obligations, just as the United States does, just as the American people do. However, they've not told China, you have to pay your debt. Now, Margaret Thatcher, on the other hand, took a very strong position in China in 1987 and told China, you have to pay your bills. You're not going to issue any more stocks or bonds on our soil, no more treasuries until you start curing the ones you already have in default. And so the People's Republic of China paid that debt in 1987 to Great Britain and are in current negotiations with the French, but they have not paid the American people.
I mean, we refer, I think, still, I do anyway, we refer to Red China as communist China, don't we?
We still do. And they're very, very proud to be a communist regime. Americans have been very good to China. We through buying their products and trade, we've taken them from a third world country, moved them into, during the Bush administration, to most favored nation status, to right into the World Trade Organization, and are now a superpower, a global power, and their goal and objective is to surpass the United States and become the leader, replacing the United States, even our currency. The U.S. dollar is the global currency. China has moved very, very heavy into the replacement of the global currency from our U.S. dollar into their own currency.
Now, what can we do? I mean, we're set up, and we're being programmed. It feels to me that we're being programmed that, oh, China's been doing this, China's been doing that. Time we owe China, we owe China. Why are we being programmed for that when China actually owes us, or Americans, and it sounds like the government too, something out of that?
Well, if you take a step back and you look at the big broad picture, China has this 1.3 billion population, and at the end of the day, corporate America, Wall Street firms, pretty much is what controls Washington, D.C. and our media, and banks and financial institutions. They all got their money on the front end. These bonds were sold, they were advertised in the New York through the New York Stock Exchange. They were advertised in the New York Times for people to buy these bonds, and through banking, financial institutions. Every time a country issues a bond, they make arrangements with the financial institutions, the banks, the entities that's going to help promote and push the sale of these bonds. Those companies and entities, they're all paid up front, anywhere from 4 to 7.5% of whatever the total issue is. So they made their money up front. So they could care less about the investors who purchased that debt, whether they get paid or not, because they've already got their money. At the end of the day, it's all about making that almighty dollar. And their fear is if they stand strong against China, they won't make as much money, or China will block them from getting business licenses to do business in China that they want to have towards that, accessing that 1.3 billion populace. And so they have a huge pro-China lobby to run blockade against issues that are negative to China or controversial, so that nothing stands in the way of them getting what they want. And most of those organizations have huge political PACs, and they make huge financial contributions to these politicians who are, running for office and wanting to stay in office. And so they show their allegiance to these PACs and these groups, so as to not support anything that may be controversial with regards to China. I mean, that's really it at the end of the day.
They have made it so over the last 50 years, since all this has happened, since the China defaulted, they have made it almost impossible to use the term communist. And it kind of makes me wonder who won that Cold War between us and Russia, the communist Russia.
That's a very good point. Very good point. There was a time in this country where the word communist, everybody understood it, everybody knew it, everybody was against it. And today, it's just simply ignored. And it's not taught to our children in our schools. The importance to be a democratic society and not support communism. But at the end of the day, we are confident that the American people will stand strong on this issue, because it's not just about 20,000 bondholders holding these bonds. But the U.S. government holding the very same bonds, that's a direct effect on every single tax-paying citizen. You know, in the last year, we've raised our debt ceiling twice. Behind the scenes, you had the people to go to China just really put an enormous amount of pressure on the U.S. government to raise that debt ceiling for the sole purpose of receiving interest payments to the People's Republic of China. And those interest payments are in the tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars a year. So instead of holding China accountable to pay their financial obligations, to pay their debt the way Americans pay their debt, we should be handing their own paper back to them. It's called a debt swap. And debt swaps are done every day around the world. And so instead of us continuing to put huge financial burden on the American people by our debt ceiling continuing to go through the roof, we shouldn't be raising our debt ceiling. And we should be bringing these bonds in to the U.S. Treasury and handing those bonds over to China in exchange for the bonds that they have of ours. And let's reduce our debt ceiling and settle and resolve this issue with the American people and the bondholders. And amazingly, just as we have the American Bondholders Foundation here in the United States, other countries where these bonds were sold have organized organizations that are recognized officially by their government representing their bondholders. And that's in France, and Belgium, and Spain, and Portugal, and Australia, and Germany, and Israel, where these bonds were sold. And at a time when everybody is counting on China to bail out, for example, all these sovereign debt crises that we see going on, if those countries held China accountable, and the banks and financial institutions like Deutsche Bank and HSBC, Bank of New York Mellon in the UK, and many, many governments, if they held China accountable for the bonds that they are holding, they wouldn't be in this sovereign debt crisis. And they wouldn't be depending on China being a cash cow that they profess to be today. They wouldn't be counting on them and relying on them to bail them out, putting them in more and more obligation debt to the PRC. I would be a cash cow too if I took people's money, borrowed it for years and years and years, for decades, and then played the big bully and refused to pay it back. And that's exactly what China has done.
Okay, I've got a little bit of a problem on the computer logging up here. We'll try to get that back on and get back up on one of my channels, which has been disconnected here. What is the government doing about this? I mean, you're representing thousands of people around the country here that have been put into this situation, and have lost their money, lost their funds, lost a lot, right?
That is correct. In fact, you talked moments ago about the 1913 bond. When that bond was actually issued, if you go back and calculate values, which our experts have done within the American Bondholders Foundation, you know, $100 U.S. dollars in 1913 was an overwhelming amount of money, and that would have been the cost to buy one of those bonds, which our government was supporting and prompting people to buy to support our then ally in the war. And so many of our soldiers who were fighting in the war bought these bonds, or their families bought these bonds, and over the years, you know, they passed away and passed them down to their children and on to the grandchildren, and have held on to these because these are true government sovereigns. And it states right on the bond that these shall, you know, pass through to every successor government. And there is an issue called successor government doctrine, which is international law, which clearly states that a successor government is responsible for the debts and financial obligations of a predecessor government or previous government. If the if the U.S. took the same position as China had taken on these bonds, and said, you know, China, all those bonds you bought back during the Clinton administration, or the Bush administration, or the Reagan administration, you know, we're not going to honor those because, gosh, that was from a different regime, that was from a different government. We're just not going to honor them. I mean, at the end of the day, no country would be buying any other country's sovereign debt. But that's basically the position. In fact, that's exactly the position that China has taken specific to this issue. They're like, well, we're the People's Republic of China, and we shouldn't have to honor this debt because it was issued by a former regime. However, that argument goes out the window because it was the People's Republic of China that paid Great Britain in 1987. And then you have another issue that China's credit rating agency has downgraded the sovereign credit rating of the United States 3 times in the last 24 months. And yet we've never defaulted.